A sunny day shattered. It was one of those perfect mornings where everything felt right with the world. The sun was warm, but not overbearing, casting a golden hue over the small park nestled in the heart of a quiet, sleepy town. Mrs. Evelyn Jenkins, a proud, elderly black woman, sat on her favorite bench beneath a grand oak tree, watching the birds hop from branch to branch. She had been coming to this park for decades, ever since she was a young woman. Now, in her twilight years, it was her sanctuary, a place where she could reflect on her life and enjoy the small, precious moments that still brought her joy. Her hair, silver and soft, framed a face lined with both the wear of time and the wisdom of years. As she sat, a soft smile danced across her lips. She watched children laugh as they played tag, couples strolling hand in hand, and an elderly man walking his small dog. Life, she thought, was finally peaceful. After all the struggles she had endured, raising her son alone after her husband passed, fighting through the challenges that came with being a black woman in a town that hadn't always welcomed her, this moment felt like a reward for surviving it all. Evelyn closed her eyes and let the gentle breeze wash over her. She thought about her son, James, who had grown into a strong, determined man. He had always been her rock, especially after her husband's death. James had inherited her fighting spirit, but with a calmness she admired. Now a successful community leader, he worked tirelessly to uplift those who, like them, had been marginalized and pushed aside. His work filled her with pride, and she often marveled at how he had channeled his frustrations into positive change. But on that serene day, as Evelyn sat quietly in her reverie, the air began to shift. A dark presence approached, shattering the peace she had so carefully preserved. She didn't see him at first, but the crunch of heavy boots on the gravel path made her look up. A man in uniform strode toward her with purpose. His face was cold, his eyes hard as stone. The badge on his chest gleamed in the sunlight, but there was nothing noble about his demeanor. He was tall and broad-shouldered, a man used to being in control, a man who thrived on the power his position afforded him. Evelyn noticed his clenched fists and tight jaw, the signs of barely contained anger. She felt a flicker of unease in her chest, but she pushed it down, refusing to believe that this man could mean her any harm. "Excuse me, ma'am," the officer said, his voice sharp and demanding. Evelyn straightened in her seat, meeting his gaze with calm dignity. "Good morning, officer," she replied, her voice steady, though her heart had begun to race. "Is there something I can help you with?" He didn't respond right away, instead looking her over with a gaze that made her feel small, as if she were an inconvenience he had to deal with. The children's laughter in the distance faded, and the peaceful ambience of the park seemed to disappear, replaced by an icy tension. "What are you doing here?" he finally asked, his voice low but menacing. Evelyn blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. She had been sitting on this bench for years, never once bothering anyone. This was her spot, her place to think, to breathe, to exist. "I'm just sitting, officer," she replied, keeping her voice polite, though there was a slight tremor in her words. "Enjoying the morning." "You can't just sit here," he snapped, stepping closer, his shadow falling over her like a dark cloud. "There are rules. People like you don't get to break them. People like me." Evelyn echoed softly, her chest tightening. She had heard those words before, many times in her life, but she had never grown used to the sting they carried. They were a reminder that no matter how far she had come, no matter what she had achieved, she would always be seen as less than. The officer's eyes narrowed as he leaned in closer. "You heard me. Get up and leave. Now." Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, but she remained seated, refusing to be bullied. She had faced too much in her life to be intimidated by this man, uniform or not. She straightened her back and looked him squarely in the eye, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she said. "This is a public park. I have every right to be here." For a moment, the officer seemed taken aback by her defiance, but then his expression darkened. His face twisted with a fury that made her stomach churn. Without warning, he grabbed her arm, yanking her up from the bench with such force that she cried out in pain. His grip was like iron, and the shock of the assault sent her mind reeling. "Don't talk back to me," he snarled. "I told you to get out." Evelyn's vision blurred with tears as she struggled to keep her balance. Her heart was racing now, not with fear, but with a deep, rising anger. How dare he? How dare this man, who didn't know her struggles, her life, treat her this way? "I won't go," she gasped, trying to wrench her arm free. "I won't let you." Before she could finish, his fist came down hard across her face. The blow was so sudden, so vicious, that it took her breath away. She stumbled back, her body crumpling to the ground as pain radiated through her skull. For a moment, the world around her spun, and all she could hear was the pounding of her heart in her ears. She lay there, dazed, her face throbbing, unable to comprehend what had just happened. She had been hit before, years ago during the civil rights marches, when she had stood shoulder to shoulder with others fighting for justice. But this was different. This was a coward's attack, unprovoked and undeserved. As she struggled to sit up, she became aware of voices, people shouting, gasping. She turned her head and saw a crowd gathering, some holding up phones, filming the scene. But no one moved to help her. Fear paralyzed them, and she knew why. They were afraid of the man in uniform, afraid of the consequences of standing up to him. The officer stood over her, his chest heaving, his face flushed with rage. He looked down at her, not with remorse, but with contempt. "Stay down, old woman," he spat. "You're lucky I don't." But before he could finish his sentence, another voice rang out, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Get your hands off my mother." The officer froze, his head snapping up to see who had spoken. The crowd parted, and from the shadows of the trees, a tall figure emerged. James Jenkins, his broad shoulders tense, his eyes blazing with fury, strode forward with a purpose that sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. James had arrived, and everything was about to change. Son's fury ignites. James Jenkins had been heading to the park for a quiet moment to himself, as he often did after a long day of work. He had left his office in a rush, eager to catch up with his mother. Mrs. Jenkins visited the park almost daily, a peaceful ritual that allowed her to reconnect with her memories, especially those of his late father. James admired how she found solace in the simple things: a bench beneath an old oak tree, the sounds of children playing, and the occasional conversation with a stranger. Today, though, something was wrong. James's pace quickened as he approached the park, his eyes scanning the familiar landscape. He spotted a small crowd gathered near his mother's usual spot, a few yards away from the bench under the tree. His gut churned, and he instinctively quickened his steps. As he moved closer, his heart dropped when he saw his mother lying on the ground, a police officer standing over her. The image burned itself into his mind. His proud, dignified mother, her once vibrant eyes now filled with fear and pain, slumped in the dirt like she was nothing. Blood trickled from her face, the sight sending a surge of rage through his veins. "Get your hands off my mother." His voice was low, but it carried across the park like a thunderclap. He could feel every eye turned toward him, the tension in the air so thick it seemed to squeeze the breath from everyone watching. The officer didn't move at first, frozen mid-action as he stood over Evelyn Jenkins, a sneer still on his lips. He had raised his hand again, as if preparing to strike her once more. James could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his fists clenching at his sides as he moved closer. His whole body trembled with fury, but his mind remained focused. This was his mother, his world, and no one, especially not a man hiding behind a badge, was going to hurt her. The officer finally turned, his eyes narrowing as he sized up the man approaching him. James was tall and broad-shouldered, his athletic build honed by years of hard work and discipline. His dark skin glistened with sweat from the short jog into the park, But it was his eyes that held the officer's attention. They were filled with an intensity that could not be ignored. There was no fear, only cold, unyielding rage. For a moment, the cop hesitated, sensing the shift in the energy around him. The crowd was no longer just watching in silence. They were now holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. James stepped forward, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached, and locked eyes with the man who had struck his mother. "I said," James growled, his voice low and dangerous, "get your hands off my mother." The officer's face twisted in a mixture of anger and arrogance. He was a man who was used to wielding his power without consequence. For years, he had been the law, the final say in situations like this. People feared him. They obeyed him. He wasn't about to let some man, no matter how intimidating, challenge that authority. His hand moved subtly toward his holster, as if the mere presence of his gun would remind James of his place. "You're her son," the officer sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Figures. You're just like her. Trouble." James took another step forward, his voice dropping even lower. "I'm only going to tell you once more. Get your hands off her." The officer's hand gripped his gun, and for a brief, terrifying moment, James saw the man's fingers twitch as if he were considering drawing it. The crowd gasped in unison, their whispers growing louder, but no one dared to intervene. They could feel the violence simmering just beneath the surface, ready to explode at any moment. "You think you're tough," the officer spat, taking a step toward James now, the space between them shrinking dangerously. "You think you can come here and tell me what to do?" James didn't flinch, though his muscles tensed, preparing for whatever might come next. His eyes flicked briefly to his mother, who was still lying on the ground, her breathing shallow, her face bruised. That image alone fueled his anger, grounding him, pushing him past the fear that had briefly tried to creep in. His mother had lived through too much. Years of systemic racism, decades of struggle, and now this. He wouldn't stand by and let it continue. The officer, sensing the challenge, grinned maliciously, clearly enjoying the tension. He still had his gun at his side, and though he hadn't drawn it, the implication was clear. He was in control here, or so he thought. "What are you going to do about it, huh?" The cop's voice was mocking, dripping with venom. "You think you can just walk in here and take over? You're nothing. You don't get to tell me how to do my job." James took another step forward, his face now only inches from the officer's. He could smell the man's sweat, see the way his jaw twitched, and though the officer was armed, James wasn't backing down. His hands clenched into fists, but he knew he couldn't let his anger control him. "Not now. Not in this moment. I'm telling you right now," James said, his voice like ice. "If you touch her again, you'll regret it." The officer laughed, a cruel sound that echoed in the stunned silence of the park. He stepped back, his eyes flicking to the crowd as if to remind them all of his authority. He was in charge here, and he wasn't about to let anyone forget that. "You'll regret it," he mocked, his hand now firmly resting on his gun. "Boy, you don't know what you're talking about. I'll tell you what's going to happen. You're going to walk away, or I'll make sure you never walk again." James felt his pulse quicken, but his expression remained cold, controlled. The fear that had momentarily gripped the crowd now turned into palpable tension, every person watching feeling like the whole scene was teetering on the edge of something explosive. A woman in the back whispered frantically into her phone, calling for backup, while others muttered nervously, their eyes darting between James and the officer. Evelyn, still lying on the ground, tried to push herself up, her vision blurry from the pain. She could hear the escalating exchange between her son and the officer, and despite her own fear, she felt a deep sadness. This was not the world she had fought for. This was not the future she had hoped for her son. "James," she whispered hoarsely, but her voice barely reached him. Suddenly, the officer's smirk vanished, replaced by a twisted sneer of pure malice. He took another step back, pulling his gun from its holster in one fluid motion. The crowd gasped. Some people screamed. But James didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stared at the man, his body tense, his mind racing with 1,000 possibilities of how this could end. "You think you're tough?" The officer snarled, his hand shaking slightly as he aimed the gun directly at James's chest. "Let's see how tough you are when you're on the ground, bleeding out." For a split second, everything froze. The air seemed to leave the park, and all James could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat. But he stood his ground, his face a mask of defiance, refusing to let this man see the fear that had briefly flickered in his chest. James had been in situations like this before, not quite as dire, but close enough to know that it wasn't just about strength, it was about control. And in this moment, he knew he had the crowd behind him. He could feel their eyes, their silent support. If the officer pulled the trigger, there would be no going back. The whole world would know what had happened here. But the officer didn't pull the trigger. His finger twitched on the safety, his face twisted in frustration. The crowd began to murmur again, louder this time, and the officer's grip on the situation started to slip. "Put the gun down," James said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through him. "You don't want to do this." The officer's sneer faltered. He looked around, realizing for the first time how many eyes were on him, how many cameras were filming, capturing every move. He knew, deep down, that this wasn't just a simple altercation anymore. It was bigger than him, bigger than James. This was about power and who held it. For a moment, the officer hesitated. His hand wavered, the gun still pointed at James's chest. Time seemed to slow down, and James could feel his heart thudding against his ribcage. He didn't know if this man would pull the trigger, didn't know if he would make it out of this park alive. But he wasn't going to back down. Not today. Not ever. "I said," James growled, his voice like steel, "put the gun down." And then, as if the weight of the world had suddenly pressed down on him, the officer's arm dropped. He lowered the gun, his hand shaking as the reality of the situation hit him. He had lost control. The crowd let out a collective breath, the tension breaking for just a moment. But it wasn't over. Not yet. The officer's face darkened, his eyes flashing with something more dangerous than rage. Humiliation. He had been bested, and he wasn't about to let that stand. Before anyone could react, he lunged at James with a primal roar, swinging his baton with brutal force. The clash of forces. The moment the officer lunged, time seemed to fracture. The baton he wielded, aimed directly at James, cut through the air with a terrifying speed. The world slowed for James as his eyes locked onto the weapon, each millisecond stretching into an eternity as the baton came closer. The crowd gasped, voices rising in a cacophony of panic, but no one moved to intervene. Fear had immobilized them. James barely managed to sidestep the first blow, the baton whistling past his head with a hair's breadth to spare. His heart raced, adrenaline pumping through his veins, but his mind remained focused. This wasn't just a fight for his life. It was a battle for his mother, for his dignity, for every injustice he and his family had endured. The officer, thrown off balance by the force of his own missed swing, staggered but quickly regained his footing, his face contorted in rage. He wasn't just angry, he was humiliated, and that humiliation had turned him into something dangerous. James could see it in his eyes. This man didn't just want to win, he wanted to destroy. For James, this moment had been building for years, a lifetime of watching people like this officer abuse their power, strip away the humanity of those they considered beneath them. He had witnessed it with his own eyes as a boy, when his father had been harassed and belittled by the police. A routine traffic stop turned into an hour-long ordeal because of the color of his skin. He had seen it when his mother was refused service at a restaurant, ignored as if she didn't exist. And now here the man in uniform represented the culmination of that anger, that oppression, that insidious belief that black lives were disposable. The second swing came faster, harder. This time, James was ready. He dodged, then ducked as the officer swung again, his baton slamming into the side of a park bench with a sickening crack. Splinters flew into the air, but the officer didn't stop. He roared, his movements growing more erratic, more unhinged with each missed attempt. The crowd, though terrified, couldn't look away. Phones were still recording, capturing every brutal second of the altercation. They whispered and shouted in disjointed bursts, some urging James to run, others calling for the officer to stop. But it was as if the two men were locked in their own world now, a world of violence and history, of rage and power, where nothing else existed. James's mind raced as he dodged another strike. He knew he couldn't just keep avoiding the blows. This officer was growing more desperate, more violent with each passing second. And it was only a matter of time before one of those swings connected. He had to end this, but how? He was unarmed, and this officer had not only his baton, but the authority of his badge and the threat of his gun. Another swing, another miss, but this time James countered. As the officer's baton flew wide, James seized the opportunity and drove his shoulder into the man's chest, knocking him off balance. The officer stumbled backward, his eyes widening in surprise, as if he hadn't expected James to fight back. But James wasn't finished. With a quick, powerful movement, he reached for the officer's arm, twisting it behind his back and forcing the baton out of his hand. For a moment, the crowd erupted into cheers, sensing a shift in power. But James knew this was far from over. The officer, though temporarily disarmed, was far from defeated. He wrenched his arm free and lunged again, this time with his fists. The two men collided in a brutal exchange of blows. The officer, though bigger and bulkier, moved with the desperation of someone who realized he was losing control. James, leaner and quicker, fought with precision, each punch thrown with the weight of his entire life behind it. This wasn't just about survival. It was about standing up for everything he and his family represented, everything they had endured. Evelyn, still lying on the ground, watched the fight unfold with a mixture of horror and helplessness. Every punch, every grunt of pain from her son made her heart ache. She tried to call out to him, tried to push herself up, but her body was too weak. She could only watch, tears streaming down her face, as the man who had brutalized her now turned his fury on her child. "James," she rasped, her voice barely audible. "James, stop." But James couldn't stop. Not now. The officer swung again, his fist connecting with James's side, sending a sharp pain shooting through his ribs. James gasped but stayed on his feet. He retaliated with a punch to the officer's jaw, sending him stumbling backward. The crowd's voices grew louder, more frantic. Some called for peace, others urged James to keep fighting, but it was clear that this was no longer a simple altercation. It had become a war of wills, a fight for survival that transcended the two men locked in combat. And then it happened. In the chaos of the struggle, the officer's hand moved to his waist. James didn't see it at first, but the crowd did. A woman screamed, pointing, her voice filled with terror. "He's reaching for his gun." James barely had time to react before the officer's hand closed around the handle of his firearm. The world seemed to tilt, the noise of the crowd fading into a distant hum as the reality of the situation hit James like a freight train. This man wasn't just trying to subdue him, he was ready to kill him. The officer's face was twisted with hatred as he pulled the gun from its holster, his movements fueled by a toxic mix of fear and fury. His hand shook as he aimed the weapon at James, his finger hovering over the trigger. "You think you can take me down?" The officer snarled, his voice low and venomous. "You think you're something special? I'm the law here. You're nothing." James stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. He had no weapon, no way to defend himself. He had faced danger before, but never like this, never with a gun pointed at his chest. His heart pounded in his ears, but even in the face of death, he stood tall, refusing to let this man see the fear that gnawed at his insides. The crowd gasped, their panic reaching a fever pitch. Some screamed for James to run. Others shouted at the officer to stop, but no one moved. The world held its breath. Evelyn, her body trembling with pain and fear, tried to rise once more. Her son's life was hanging in the balance, and she couldn't just lie there, helpless. With a strength she didn't know she still had, she pushed herself up onto her knees, her vision swimming, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking with desperation. "Please, stop." But her words didn't reach the officer. He was too far gone, too consumed by his own hatred. His hand tightened on the gun, and James saw the moment of decision flash in his eyes. The trigger was about to be pulled. And then, as if by some divine intervention, a voice broke through the tension. A deep, authoritative voice, one that commanded immediate attention. "Put the gun down." The crowd turned as one, their eyes widening in shock and relief. From the far side of the park, a group of uniformed officers had arrived, guns drawn, their faces grim. The lead officer, a tall black man with a voice that seemed to shake the very ground, took a step forward, his eyes locked on the row cop. "Officer McLean, put the gun down now," the lead officer shouted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This ends here." For a moment, McLean hesitated. His hand shook, his eyes darting between James and the approaching officers. He had lost control of the situation, and he knew it. But the rage still simmered beneath the surface, the humiliation of being bested by a man he considered beneath him eating away at his last shreds of reason. "Put it down," the lead officer barked again, his gun trained steadily on McLean. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, McLean's arm dropped. The gun slipped from his fingers and hit the ground with a dull thud. The crowd let out a collective sigh of relief, but the tension didn't fully dissipate. The danger was still palpable, hanging in the air like a storm cloud. The lead officer moved in quickly, motioning for his team to cuff McLean. Two officers rushed forward, grabbing him by the arms and forcing him to the ground. McLean didn't resist, but the look in his eyes told James that this wasn't over. Not for him. The hatred burned deep, and it wasn't something that would be extinguished easily. James stood there, breathing heavily, his body aching from the fight. But he didn't feel victorious. He felt hollow, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. He turned to his mother, who had collapsed back onto the ground, her face pale, her body trembling with exhaustion. He rushed to her side, kneeling down and cradling her in his arms. "Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here. I've got you." Evelyn looked up at her son, her eyes filled with pain but also with pride. She reached up with a trembling hand and touched his cheek, her fingers stained with the dirt and blood from the struggle. "You're safe," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with love. "Thank God, you're safe." James closed his eyes, holding her close, the weight of the moment finally crashing down on him. He had fought for her, for their dignity, for their right to exist without fear. But he knew this was only the beginning. The battle for justice wasn't over, not for him, not for his mother, and not for the countless others who faced the same hatred and violence every day. As the officers led McLean away, the crowd began to disperse, murmuring in hushed tones about what they had witnessed. Some stayed behind, offering their support, their words of encouragement, but James barely heard them. His focus was solely on his mother, on making sure she was okay. But deep down, he knew that what had happened here today would ripple far beyond this small park. The fight for justice had only just begun. The aftermath of silence and shouts. The ambulance arrived at the park with its sirens cutting through the late afternoon air, an eerie contrast to the peace that once defined this place. For what felt like hours, though it had only been moments since the violent confrontation, the park had transformed into a tense battleground. a place where the ugliness of hatred and brutality was laid bare for all to see. And now it was a scene of quiet devastation. James knelt beside his mother, still holding her frail body in his arms as the paramedics rushed toward them. Evelyn's breath was shallow, her eyes half closed in exhaustion. Blood had dried on her lips, her face swollen from the blows she'd endured. But even through her pain, she managed to lift a hand and touch James's cheek, her fingers shaking. Her touch was light, but filled with meaning. A reminder that she was still there, still fighting, still holding on. "Mom, stay with me," James whispered, his voice cracking. His heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline from the fight still coursing through his veins. "You're going to be okay. They're going to take care of you." Evelyn blinked slowly, her eyes clouded with both pain and love. She wanted to speak, to tell James not to worry, but the words wouldn't come. She had been through too much today, too much violence, too much fear. Her body was battered, her spirit shaken, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly fragile. The paramedics reached them, gently guiding James aside as they began to work on Evelyn. He hesitated, unwilling to let go of her, but the urgency in their eyes told him he had to step back. As they lifted her onto the stretcher, he stood there, feeling helpless, watching as they checked her vitals, whispered words to one another that he couldn't make out. His fists clenched at his sides. He had fought for her, but the battle wasn't over. Not yet. The crowd had mostly dispersed by now, leaving behind a few stragglers who were still processing what they had just witnessed. Some approached James, offering soft words of support, but he barely heard them. His mind was consumed with worry for his mother, with anger at what had been done to her, and with the realization that this moment, this brutal display of injustice, would mark them both for the rest of their lives. As the paramedics prepared to load Evelyn into the ambulance, one of them turned to James, her expression kind but professional. "We're taking her to County General," she said softly. "She's stable for now, but she's been through a lot. You can ride with us if you want." James nodded, swallowing hard as he glanced at his mother, lying so still on the stretcher. He felt a pang of guilt. She had always been so strong for him, and now it was his turn to be strong for her. Without another word, he climbed into the back of the ambulance, his eyes never leaving her as they closed the doors and sped toward the hospital. Hours passed in a blur of stereo lights and whispered conversations. James sat in the waiting room, his hands clasped tightly together, his mind racing. The hospital was cold, the smell of antiseptic thick in the air. He stared at the white walls, at the steady stream of doctors and nurses moving through the halls, but none of it registered. All he could think about was his mother in the ICU, surrounded by machines that beeped and whirred, keeping track of her every breath. He had called a few close friends to let them know what had happened, but for the most part, he had stayed silent, processing the day's events in a quiet fury. The image of that officer, McLean, still burned in his mind. The way he had looked at his mother, the sneer on his face, the hatred in his eyes, and then the gun. James could still feel the weight of that moment, the way time had seemed to stop when McLean had drawn his weapon, ready to end James's life as if it meant nothing. The thought made James's stomach turn. He had come so close to losing everything in that park, his mother, his own life, and it all boiled down to one thing: the color of his skin. The door to the waiting room opened, and James looked up, his heart leaping into his throat. A doctor stepped in, her expression serious but calm. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and a steady gaze, and James immediately stood as she approached. "Mr. Jenkins," she asked, her voice professional but not unkind. "I'm Dr. Patel. Your mother is stable for now, but she's suffered significant trauma. She's going to need time to recover, both physically and emotionally." James nodded, his throat tight. "Can I see her?" Dr. Patel hesitated for a moment before nodding. "She's still very weak, and we've given her something for the pain, so she may not be fully alert. But you can sit with her." James didn't wait for further permission. He followed the doctor down the hall, his footsteps heavy with worry. As they reached the door to his mother's room, Dr. Patel gave him a brief nod before stepping aside to let him in. The room was quiet, except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Evelyn lay in the hospital bed, her frail body looking even smaller beneath the crisp white sheets. Her face was bruised, her lips swollen, but her eyes fluttered open as James approached. "Mom," he whispered, pulling a chair close to the bed. He sat down and took her hand in his, careful not to disturb the IV line. "I'm here." Evelyn turned her head slightly, her eyes focusing on him. There was pain in her gaze, but also relief. She squeezed his hand weakly, her voice barely a whisper. "You're okay," she rasped, her words slow and deliberate. James nodded, his heart breaking as he looked at her. "I'm okay, Mom. But I'm worried about you. How are you feeling?" Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her strength. "I'll be fine," she whispered, though James could see the toll the day had taken on her. She opened her eyes again, meeting his gaze with a fierceness that belied her weakened state. "What happened back there? It's not right." James felt a lump form in his throat. "I know," he said quietly. "I know." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the day pressing down on both of them. James wanted to say more, to express the anger and frustration that had been building inside him, but he didn't want to burden his mother with it. Not now. She needed to rest. But Evelyn wasn't finished. "You have to fight this, James," she said softly, her voice gaining strength. "Don't let what he did go unanswered." James looked at her, his jaw tightening. He had been thinking the same thing, but hearing it from his mother gave him the clarity he needed. This wasn't just about one man's violence. It was about a system that had allowed that violence to fester and go unchecked for far too long. It was about all the times people like his mother had been hurt, humiliated, and silenced. "I will," he promised, his voice low and firm. "I'm going to fight this." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The video of the confrontation in the park had gone viral within hours, spreading across social media like wildfire. News outlets picked up the story, and soon James and his mother found themselves at the center of a national conversation about police brutality, racism, and the abuse of power. James had never sought the spotlight, but now it was unavoidable. Journalists called, activists reached out, and community leaders rallied around him. There were protests in the streets, people demanding justice not just for Evelyn, but for all the victims of police violence who had come before her. Signs bearing slogans like "No Justice," "No Peace," and "Black Lives Matter" filled the streets as people marched, their voices loud and unrelenting. James attended the protests, his face a mask of determination as he stood at the front lines, speaking out against the injustice that had nearly taken his mother from him. He gave interviews, telling the world what had happened that day in the park, using his platform to shine a light on the systemic issues that had allowed McLean and officers like him to terrorize communities of color for far too long. But even as the movement grew, James knew the fight was far from over. McLean had been suspended, pending an internal investigation, but James wasn't naive. He knew how these things worked. Too often, officers were given a slap on the wrist, allowed to return to their jobs as if nothing had happened. He couldn't let that happen this time. He wouldn't let it happen. He met with lawyers, filed a formal complaint against McLean, and worked with local activists to push for real systemic change. He called for the defunding of police departments, for the reallocation of resources to community services that would actually help people rather than harm them. And through it all, his mother remained his inspiration, her quiet strength fueling his determination. Evelyn, though still recovering, kept a close eye on everything. She watched the news from her hospital bed, her heart swelling with pride as she saw her son standing tall, leading the charge for justice. But there was also a deep sadness in her, a grief that came from knowing that even after all these years, the fight was still the same. The faces had changed, but the struggle remained. One afternoon, as James sat beside her bed, she reached out and took his hand. "You're doing the right thing," she said softly, "but you need to take care of yourself too." James smiled weakly, squeezing her hand. "I will, Mom. But this fight, it's not just about us. It's about everyone who's been through this." Evelyn nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "I know, but don't lose yourself in it. Don't let the hate consume you." James looked down at their hands, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He understood what she meant. The anger inside him, the righteous fury that had kept him going these past few days, was powerful. But it was also dangerous. If he let it, it could burn him out, leave him hollow and bitter. "I won't," he promised, though he wasn't sure how he could keep that vow. As the weeks passed, the case against Officer McLean gained momentum. The public pressure was too great to ignore, and soon McLean was arrested and charged with assault and misconduct. It was a victory, but James knew it was only the beginning. There were still countless officers like McLean out there, still countless families suffering in silence. But for now, he had won this battle. His mother was recovering, the community was rallying, and for the first time in a long while, James felt a glimmer of hope. He sat with his mother one evening, the sun setting outside the hospital window, casting a warm glow over the room. Evelyn was sitting up in bed, her strength slowly returning, though the bruises on her face were still visible, a stark reminder of what they had endured. "Do you think things will change?" she asked quietly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. James followed her gaze, thinking about everything they had been through, everything they had fought for. He didn't have an answer, not really. But he had hope, and maybe for now, that was enough. "I think they will," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "We'll make sure they do." The long road to justice. The courthouse loomed before James like a fortress, its imposing stone walls casting long shadows on the street below. It was an early morning, but the sky was already painted with thick, low-hanging clouds, as if nature itself anticipated the storm that was about to unfold within those walls. James stood at the steps, his eyes tracing the lines of the building's architecture, trying to ground himself in the moment. Today was the beginning of the legal battle, an uphill fight against a system designed to protect people like Officer McLean and marginalize people like him and his mother. James inhaled deeply, the air sharp and cold in his lungs. His lawyer, Marcus Reese, stood beside him, a man known for his relentless pursuit of justice in cases of police misconduct. Tall and sharp-dressed, Marcus radiated confidence, but his eyes held a seriousness that told James this wouldn't be an easy victory. "This is it," Marcus said quietly, adjusting the strap of his briefcase. "Once we walk through those doors, everything we've prepared for comes into play." James nodded, swallowing the knot of anxiety in his throat. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, sleepless nights poring over legal documents, giving statements to the media, speaking at rallies. The weight of it all sat heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just about his mother anymore. It had grown beyond them. It was about accountability, about exposing the deep-rooted corruption and racism embedded within the very institutions meant to protect. But most of all, it was about making sure McLean, and others like him, couldn't walk away without consequence. Behind him, a small group of supporters gathered, friends, activists, community leaders who had been with him from the beginning. They carried signs that read, "Justice for Evelyn Jenkins," and "End Police Brutality." Their presence reminded James of the importance of this fight. He wasn't alone. The crowd grew larger as more people arrived, their voices murmuring with quiet determination. News crews hovered nearby, their cameras trained on the courthouse steps, ready to capture every moment of what was sure to be a high-profile trial. James felt his mother's absence like a physical ache. Evelyn was still recovering at home, too weak to attend the trial in person, but she had made it clear that she would be watching every second of it from her hospital bed. He could almost hear her voice in his head, telling him to stay strong, to keep his head up, to never waver. She had been his guiding force throughout this ordeal, her quiet strength the anchor that had kept him grounded in the face of overwhelming odds. As they reached the entrance to the courthouse, Marcus turned to James, his expression serious. "You ready?" James nodded, though his insides churned with a mix of fear and resolve. "I'm ready." They stepped through the heavy wooden doors into the cool, sterile air of the courthouse. The interior was a stark contrast to the world outside. Bright fluorescent lights illuminated the marble floors, and the hum of quiet conversation echoed off the walls. Lawyers in crisp suits moved purposefully through the halls. Clerks shuffled papers, and uniformed officers stood near the entrance, their eyes scanning the room. James felt the familiar knot of unease tighten in his chest as he passed them. The trial was set to begin in courtroom 4, a large, imposing space with high ceilings and long wooden benches. As they entered, James's eyes were immediately drawn to the front of the room, where the judge's bench stood elevated, symbolizing the power and authority that would decide the outcome of this case. It felt distant, almost unreachable. On the other side of the room, Officer McLean sat with his defense team, his face set in a mask of indifference. He looked every bit the part of a man convinced of his own righteousness, his crisp blue suit and carefully groomed appearance a stark contrast to the brutality he had unleashed in the park that day. His eyes met James's for a brief moment, and James saw a flicker of something cold and calculating behind them, a man who still believed he would walk away from this unscathed. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on James's shoulder, snapping him out of his thoughts. "Remember, this is a marathon, not a sprint. Today is just the beginning." James nodded, though the pressure weighed heavily on him. He took a seat beside Marcus, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his mind racing through everything that had led them to this moment. The trial began with the usual formalities. The judge, a stern-faced man in his 60s, called the courtroom to order, his voice booming through the room as he laid out the proceedings. The jury, a mix of men and women of different races and backgrounds, filed in and took their seats, their expressions neutral, though James couldn't help but wonder what they were thinking. Would they see the truth of what had happened, or would they be swayed by McLean's defense, a narrative that would likely paint him as a man merely doing his job? The opening statements began, and as expected, McLean's defense team immediately framed him as the victim of an unfair situation. They painted a picture of a police officer who had been doing his duty, who had been put in a difficult position by a hostile situation in the park. They didn't outright say it, but the implication was clear. They wanted the jury to see James and his mother as the aggressors, to view them through the lens of bias that had been cultivated over decades of systemic racism. He was acting within the scope of his duties as an officer. McLean's attorney, a sharp-tongued man named Stephen Harper, argued, his voice confident and commanding. Officer McLean was responding to what he perceived as a threat. It's easy to judge his actions in hindsight, but in the heat of the moment, he had to make a split-second decision to protect himself and the public. James felt a wave of anger wash over him as he listened to Harper twist the truth. Protecting himself. From what? An elderly woman sitting on a park bench. His mother had been sitting quietly, enjoying a peaceful morning when McLean had assaulted her without provocation. James clenched his fists beneath the table, but Marcus shot him a warning glance, reminding him to stay calm. When it was Marcus's turn to present their side, he rose slowly from his seat, adjusting his tie before walking to the center of the courtroom. His presence commanded attention, and the room fell silent as he began to speak. "This case isn't just about one man's actions," Marcus said, his voice steady and authoritative. "It's about a pattern of abuse and misconduct by an officer who believed he was above the law. Officer McLean didn't act to protect anyone that day. He acted out of hatred, out of a deep-seated belief that he could use his badge to brutalize an innocent woman without consequence." Marcus turned to the jury, locking eyes with each of them as he spoke. This isn't just about what happened to Mrs. Evelyn Jenkins, though that is horrific enough. This is about sending a message that police officers are not above the law, that they cannot use their power to harm, to intimidate, to destroy lives, and then walk away without accountability. The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on Marcus as he laid out the case. He detailed the events of that day, using video footage captured by bystanders to show exactly what had happened. The grainy footage was projected onto a screen. The images of McLean striking Evelyn, of James confronting him, and of the gun being drawn, all playing out in stark, undeniable detail. The jury watched in silence, their faces grim. As the trial progressed, witness after witness took the stand, each one adding another layer to the narrative. Bystanders who had been in the park that day testified, their voices filled with emotion as they recounted the horror they had witnessed. James listened to them with a mix of gratitude and frustration. Gratitude that they had come forward, that they were helping to build the case. Frustration that this was even necessary, that they had to fight so hard just to prove what should have been obvious from the start. Then came the most difficult moment, when James himself was called to testify. He had known this was coming, had prepared for it, but as he took the stand and faced the jury, he felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. He was not just speaking for himself or his mother, he was speaking for all those who had been silenced, for all those who had been brutalized and dismissed by the very institutions meant to protect them. Marcus began the questioning gently, allowing James to recount the events of that day in his own words. James spoke clearly, though his voice wavered at times as he relived the horror of what had happened. He described the moment he saw his mother on the ground, the rage and helplessness that had surged through him, the terrifying moment when McLean had drawn his gun. "It wasn't just about me or my mom," James said, his voice growing stronger as he addressed the jury. "It was about everything we've had to endure, about the fear that so many people like us live with every day." That officer looked at us and saw something less than human, and that's why he thought he could get away with it. Marcus let James's words hang in the air for a moment before stepping back, giving him a reassuring nod. James could see the impact his testimony had on the jury. Some of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others nodded in quiet agreement, but the battle wasn't over yet. McLean's defense attorney, Harper, approached the stand, his face a mask of cold calculation. He wasted no time trying to dismantle James's testimony, attempting to paint him as an emotional, irrational man who had overreacted in a tense situation. "You were angry, weren't you?" Harper asked, his voice smooth and predatory. "You saw your mother on the ground, and you let your emotions take control. You didn't think, you acted. Isn't that right?" James stared at Harper, his jaw clenched. "Of course I was angry," he replied, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Anyone would be angry if they saw their mother being attacked. But I didn't act out of rage. I acted to protect her." Harper smirked, but James refused to back down. The defense attorney tried to twist his words, to make it seem as though James had escalated the situation, but James held firm. He knew the truth, and so did everyone else in that courtroom. The trial dragged on for days, each side presenting their arguments, their evidence, their witnesses. The weight of it all pressed down on James like a physical burden, but through it all, he kept his focus on the end goal: justice for his mother, and for everyone who had been wronged by people like McLean. As the final day of the trial approached, the courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and members of the public. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen, to hear the verdict that would either deliver justice or crush their hopes. Marcus delivered his closing argument with the same fire and conviction he had carried throughout the trial, reminding the jury that this case wasn't just about one day in a park. It was about a system that had allowed people like McLean to abuse their power for far too long. Harper, in contrast, doubled down on his defense of McLean, insisting that the officer had acted within his rights and that the situation had simply gotten out of hand. But there was a desperation in his voice now, a sense that he knew his case was crumbling. The jury deliberated for hours, the tension in the courthouse palpable. James sat in the waiting area, his hands trembling as he thought about what was at stake. He had fought so hard, had poured everything into this battle, but now it was out of his hands. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent as the judge asked the foreperson to read the verdict. On the charge of assault in the second degree, the foreperson began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. We find the defendant, Officer Thomas McLean, guilty. James's heart skipped a beat. Guilty. The word echoed in his mind, bringing with it a rush of relief, of vindication. The room erupted into murmurs, some people gasping in surprise, others clapping softly. The tension that had gripped James for weeks finally began to ease, though he knew this was just one step in a long journey. McLean sat motionless, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table as the weight of the verdict settled over him. For the first time, James saw something resembling fear in the officer's eyes. The man who had once believed he was untouchable was now facing the consequences of his actions. But for James, this was more than just a personal victory. It was a step toward something larger, toward a world where justice could prevail, where people like his mother wouldn't have to live in fear of those who were supposed to protect them. As the court adjourned and people began filing out of the room, Marcus turned to James and offered him a small, proud smile. "We did it," he said quietly. James nodded, though the weight of everything still pressed down on him. "Yeah," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But the fight's not over. Not yet." Marcus nodded, understanding. "No, it's not. But this is a start." James looked around the room, at the people who had supported him, at the reporters who had chronicled every moment of this journey, and at the empty seat where McLean had sat moments earlier. The battle for justice wasn't over. It never really would be. But for now, they had won a victory. And that was enough to keep going. As James walked out of the courthouse, the cold morning air hit his face, but this time it felt different. It felt like the first breath of something new. A future where justice wasn't just a dream, but a reality within reach. Healing and a new dawn. The trial was over, but the echoes of its impact reverberated throughout the city and far beyond. The courthouse steps, once the scene of tension and anticipation, were now a place of quiet reflection. The crowds had thinned, the media trucks were gone, and the noise had faded. But for James Jenkins, the real work had only just begun. It had been 3 weeks since Officer Thomas McLean had been found guilty. The verdict had sent shockwaves through the community, a rare moment where justice had prevailed in a system that so often failed the people it was supposed to protect. But while McLean's conviction had been a victory, James knew that this was only one battle in a much larger war. The deep, systemic racism that had allowed McLean to act with such impunity still existed, still thrived in the shadows of every police department, every courtroom, and every institution built to protect the powerful. As James sat on the porch of his mother's small house, watching the late afternoon sun dip below the horizon, he felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. The cool breeze rustled the leaves of the oak tree in the front yard, the same tree he had played under as a child. Its branches stretched out like arms, a reminder of both the strength and fragility of life. His mother, Evelyn Jenkins, rested inside, recovering slowly but surely. The bruises on her face had faded, but the emotional scars were still fresh, both for her and for James. He heard the screen door creak open behind him, and his mother stepped out onto the porch. She was wrapped in a light blanket, her silver hair tucked neatly beneath a soft scarf. She moved slowly, still weak from the ordeal, but her presence radiated the quiet strength that had always been her defining trait. Evelyn sat down beside her son, and for a moment they said nothing, simply watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink as the sun set. "How are you feeling today, Mom?" James asked softly, breaking the silence. Evelyn smiled faintly, her eyes tired but full of warmth. "I'm getting there, James. It's going to take time, but I'll be okay." James nodded, but he couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at him. "I should have protected you better," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have been there sooner. None of this should have happened." Evelyn reached over and placed her hand on his. Her grip was soft but steady, and when she spoke, her voice was filled with the wisdom of a lifetime spent surviving in a world that wasn't built for people like her. "James," she said gently, "what happened wasn't your fault. You were there when I needed you most. You stood up for me. And you stood up for something bigger than both of us. That's more than I could ever ask for." James looked down at their hands, her words offering some comfort, but the pain was still there. He had spent his entire life trying to shield his mother from the harsh realities of the world. But on that day in the park, he had been reminded of just how powerless he truly was against the weight of history and injustice. "I just want things to change," James whispered, his voice tight. "I don't want anyone else to go through what we did." Evelyn nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Things are changing," she said softly. "Maybe not as fast as we'd like, but they are. What you did, what we've been through, it's going to make a difference." James wasn't sure if he believed that. Yes, McLean had been convicted, but how many more McLeans were out there? How many more lives would be destroyed before the system was truly held accountable? The weight of it all seemed unbearable at times, but as he looked at his mother, sitting beside him, alive and still fighting, he knew he couldn't give up. Not now. The sound of footsteps on the gravel path leading up to the house pulled James from his thoughts. He looked up to see a familiar figure approaching. Marcus Reese, his lawyer and now a trusted friend. Marcus had been instrumental in securing McLean's conviction, and over the course of the trial, he and James had developed a deep respect for one another. "Evening, Mrs. Jenkins," Marcus greeted warmly as he stepped onto the porch, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the fading light. "How are you feeling?" Evelyn smiled at him. "Getting better every day, thanks to you and my son here." Marcus smiled back, but his expression soon turned serious as he turned to James. "I wanted to talk to you about the next steps," he said. "Now that the trial is over, there's a lot of attention on this case. People are looking to you, James. They want to know what's next." James sighed, leaning back in his chair. He had expected this. The trial had brought national attention to their fight, and in the weeks since the verdict, activists and community leaders from across the country had reached out to him, asking him to speak at rallies, to join protests, to continue the fight for systemic change. "I know," James said, his voice heavy, "but I don't know if I'm ready for all of that. I'm not a politician or an activist. I just wanted justice for my mother." "And you got it," Marcus replied. "But this is bigger than just your family. People are looking to you because they see someone who stood up and fought back. You've become a symbol of what's possible when we don't back down." Evelyn, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "James, you've always been strong. You've always been a leader, even if you didn't see it in yourself. I think Marcus is right. You've started something, and now it's time to finish it." James looked at his mother, her face lined with the wisdom of years, and felt a swell of emotion rise in his chest. She had always believed in him, even when he doubted himself. He had spent his whole life trying to make her proud. And now, in this moment, he realized that continuing this fight wasn't just about justice. It was about honoring everything she had taught him. "I don't know if I have what it takes," James admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus sat down on the porch railing, his eyes steady and calm. "You do, James. You've already proven that. You don't have to do it alone. There are people out there who want to help, who want to stand with you. This isn't just about one trial. It's about changing the entire system, and that's going to take time and a lot of voices." James was silent for a long time, the weight of Marcus's words settling over him. He had always been a man of quiet strength, someone who worked behind the scenes, But now he was being asked to step into the light, to lead a movement that had been building for generations. "Where do I even start?" he finally asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. Marcus smiled. "You've already started. The question is, how far are you willing to go?" Over the next few weeks, James found himself drawn deeper into the world of activism. What had begun as a fight for his mother's justice had grown into something much larger, a movement to hold police accountable, to demand reforms that would prevent officers like McLean from terrorizing communities with impunity. He was invited to speak at rallies, to meet with lawmakers, to sit on panels discussing police reform and racial justice. At first, it was overwhelming. James had never been comfortable with public speaking, and the pressure to live up to the expectations of those around him weighed heavily on his mind. But every time he felt himself falter, he thought of his mother, of the quiet strength she had shown throughout her life, of the dignity she had maintained even in the face of violence and oppression. He couldn't let her down. He couldn't let the people who were counting on him down. The community rallied around him. The support was overwhelming, and for the first time, James began to feel the power of collective action. It wasn't just him against the world. There were hundreds, thousands of people standing beside him, demanding the same change, the same justice. The rallies grew larger, the calls for reform louder. James became a leading voice in the movement to defund the police and reallocate resources toward community services that would actually help people: mental health services, housing initiatives, education programs. It was a long, slow fight, and there were moments when it felt like they weren't making progress, but James refused to give up. One evening, as James prepared to give a speech at a large rally in front of City Hall, his phone buzzed with a text message. He pulled it out and saw a message from his mother. "I'm proud of you. Keep going. Love, Mom." The words brought tears to his eyes. His mother had always been his rock, and now, even as she healed from her injuries, she was still the one giving him strength. The rally was packed. Hundreds of people crowded the steps of City Hall, holding signs that read, "No justice, no peace, and defund the police." As James stepped up to the podium, the crowd erupted in cheers, their voices a thunderous wave of support. James took a deep breath, feeling the weight of their expectations, but also the power of their unity. He had come a long way from that day in the park, from the moment he had watched his mother be brutalized, helpless to stop it. Now he was standing before a sea of people, their faces filled with hope, with determination, with a shared belief that change was possible. "Thank you," James began, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Thank you for being here, for standing with us, for fighting with us." The crowd cheered again, but James held up a hand, quieting them. "This fight isn't over," he said, his voice strong and steady. "We've made progress, but there's still so much work to be done. We're fighting for a world where our mothers, our fathers, our children don't have to live in fear of the people who are supposed to protect them. We're fighting for accountability, for justice, for a system that serves all of us, not just a select few." He paused, looking out at the faces before him. "I'm here because of my mother," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here because of everything she's taught me, everything she's endured. And I'm here because I believe that together we can create a world where people like her, like me, like all of us, are treated with the dignity and respect we deserve." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices swelling in unison, and James felt a surge of hope rise within him. This was more than just a rally, more than just a movement. This was a revolution, one built on love, on justice, on the belief that a better world was possible. As the sun set behind the city skyline, casting the world in shades of gold and crimson, James looked out at the crowd and knew that they were on the cusp of something new. The road ahead would be long, and the battles would be hard, but for the first time, he truly believed they could win. And they would.